Again, thank you so much for joining us today. With that, I'll pass the floor to Nathaniel to get us started.
Thank you, Ren. Thank you. And thank you to all of you for showing up. Wow, what a great crowd we've got already. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nathaniel Stinnett. I'm the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. And this is an introduction to the Environmental Voter Project webinar. We are going to go through what we do here at EVP, why we do it, how we do it, the results that we get, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. And for those of you who are still joining us and may not have heard what Ren said at the beginning, as we go along, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. Ren will try to answer them. Some she will not answer because she's going to save them for me during the Q&A session. All right, without further ado, let's get started and start talking about the Environmental Voter Project. In a nutshell, the Environmental Voter Project is a nonpartisan nonprofit that is laser focused on identifying people who care deeply about climate yet don't vote, and then turning them into better voters. That's it. That's it. We find people who care about climate and the environment who aren't voting, and then we turn them into better voters. Now, what that also means, though, is that we don't focus on the stuff that a lot of other great environmental groups do focus their time on. So, for instance, we don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. We don't even, as odd as this might sound, we don't even try to convince people to care more about climate change or the environment. In fact, a good way to think about our work is we're not even in the mind-changing business at all. Instead, we are solely in the behavior-changing business. What we are trying to do at EVP is bypass the hard, messy stuff of politics. We don't want to have to work to change people's minds. That's important work, but let's let other groups do that. Instead, we want to find the people whose minds don't need to be changed. We want to find the people who already care so deeply about climate or the environment that it's their number one priority, yet they aren't voting. And then what that enables us to do is jump in with a purely behavioral intervention. We want to be in the habit or behavior changing business, not the mind changing business. Now, the reason why we take this very unique focus is because we're trying to address one of the biggest, if not the biggest problem that we have currently in the climate movement. And that is that there aren't enough voters who list climate as a top priority. What you're looking at right here is exit polling data from 2020. So not the most recent election, but the 2020 presidential election. Only 4% of voters, 4%, said that climate change or the environment was their number one priority. Now, if we fast forward to the presidential election that we just held, the number got a little bit bigger, and that's good. But we can't waste too much time patting ourselves on the back because 7% is still nowhere close to being enough to really push politicians to lead on climate. And this is what I want to stress right now, because there is a tendency for advocacy groups to talk about how strong they are. And oh my gosh, if these dumb politicians just paid attention to what is clear, which is that we are really, really strong, well, then the world would be so much better. No, I'm sorry. I think we need to confront the very inconvenient truth here that the climate movement does not have nearly enough political power as we need. Not even close. Because when only 7% of voters show up and list climate as their top priority, a few things happen. First, it becomes incredibly hard to elect climate leaders. But second, even when we do elect good climate leaders, we all know it isn't like they can then just snap their fingers and get everything they want done, right? No, they still need to pick and choose what to spend their political capital on. And they ain't going to spend it on the issue that only 7% of voters list as their top priority. This is the biggest problem we face in the climate movement right now. It's not a lack of solutions. It's not a lack of scientific understanding. It's not a lack of technology. It's not a lack of policy proposals. It's a lack of political will, where even politicians who understands the climate crisis, even politicians who want to confront it, don't have the political might behind them to justify leading on that issue. Because at the end of the day, politicians need to do what is politically salient and important to large groups of voters. And right now, there just aren't enough climate voters out there to force politicians, not just on the federal level, but also on the state and local level, to do what physics and science demand us to do. All right. I promise this all isn't going to be doom and gloom, okay? All right. So why do we at the Environmental Voter Project see data like this? And I promise you, these exit polls are no different from other polls and other exit polls in races up and down the ballot. Why do we see data like this and decide, okay, we're going to focus on finding environmentalists who don't vote and get them to the polls? Well, the reason is this. It turns out that so few voters list climate as their top priority, not because Americans don't care about climate change, but rather because the ones who do care about climate change just aren't voting. And this creates real problems. And it creates problems because of this. If there is only one thing that you take away from this intro to EVP webinar today, let it be what I'm about to say, because I think it's crucially important. Who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote or not is public record. It's public record. And because so few environmentalists vote, politicians can see on voter files who is voting and who isn't voting. And this has huge ramifications. Because if you are in the elections business and you can look at public voter files and determine who is likely to vote in your election and who is likely to skip it, let me tell you what happens. First, campaigns, well, they can't target everybody. They've got limited time and limited money, and they only want to get 50% plus one of the vote on a Tuesday in November. So they're going to look at those public voter files. They're going to see who votes and who doesn't vote. And they're going to spend most, not all, but most of their time and money talking to people who show up. And if campaigns spend most of their time and money only talking to regular voters, well, who do you think they're going to poll to figure out what issues to prioritize? Not the non-voters, not the people who have a history of not showing up. I mean, let's be honest. Why would a politician care about non-voters? And they literally know who these voters and non-voters are by name and street address because it is public record. No, they're going to poll the likely voters. And this is bad news for the environment because of polling data like this. Every politician knows who votes and who doesn't vote in their district, and those are the people whose priorities they care about. But as I mentioned earlier, the reason so few people who prioritize climate change are showing up in these polls of likely voters is not because nobody cares about climate change. Rather, it's because environmentalists just aren't voting. It turns out that there are tens of millions of already registered voters who care so deeply about climate and the environment that it's their number one priority. But why Isn't that causing politicians to lead on climate and lead on clean air and lead on clean water? Well, because they're not voting. Remember what I said is the one thing you need to remember from this briefing. Whether you vote or not is public record. So if you're someone who cares deeply about climate and the environment, yet you aren't voting, every politician from city council up to president knows that. And they aren't going to give a damn about you or your priorities because you're not going to help them win elections. All right. I realize I just made a pretty big assertion, which is that there are lots of environmentalists who aren't voting. So let's put some numbers on that for you. In the 22 presidential election, we estimate that across all 50 states, 13 million already registered voters who list climate or other environmental issues as their top priority just didn't vote. 13 million. Heading into the most recent presidential election, now voter files haven't been updated yet, so we don't know for certain who voted and who didn't vote, but heading into it, we could look at people's previous voting histories. And our estimates were, across all 50 states, that over 10 million already registered super environmentalists were unlikely to vote. 10 million. 10 million. In a presidential election where the margins are 30, 40, 50, 100,000 in just a handful of states, and 10 million already registered dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists don't vote. And I imagine many of you are shaking your heads in frustration right now, and I get it. I understand that stuff like this can be frustrating. But what I'd like to suggest to you over the coming minutes is that as frustrating as this is, it's also an enormous opportunity. Because we live at a moment in time where it's become almost impossible to change people's minds about anything, but especially climate change. Yet these are millions of people who don't need their minds changed. They already care deeply about climate and the environment. No, they just need their behavior nudged. And I won't claim that's easy. Of course it's not easy. But what it is easier than changing people's minds. And it's a hell of a lot cheaper. And we're going to show you how we go about identifying and mobilizing these non-voting environmentalists, and then the results that we're getting. But before I get there, I do just want to spend a little bit more time on the size of this population. Because again, when we start talking about these numbers, sometimes people are like, oh my gosh, that's enormous. So let's drill down into this a little bit more. If we go back to the 22 midterm election, I want to show you some data here from a poll that looked at both likely voters, so people who had a history of voting in midterm elections, and unlikely voters, people who had a history of skipping midterm elections. And these people were asked, we looked at Pennsylvania and Nevada, two important swing states, how important climate change is when choosing a candidate. Is it the single most important factor? Is it one of many important factors? Is it only somewhat important? You can see all the choices down there. Well, among likely voters in Nevada, look, 5% said climate change was the single most important factor when choosing a candidate. Not much, not nothing, but you know, something, but not much. But when you look at unlikely voters, the ones who don't show up for midterm elections, was twice as many. 10% said climate was their number one priority. Go to Pennsylvania, not an unimportant swing state. It's the same story. Only 3% of people who have a history of voting in midterms said climate was the most important factor when they chose a candidate. 7% of the low propensity voters did. This is the imbalance that I'm talking about here. We have a huge pool of potential political power in the climate movement. People who don't need their minds changed. They are already with us, not just because they care about climate, because it's literally their number one priority. They're just not showing up when we need them most, which is on election days. This is the problem that we are trying to solve at the Environmental Voter Project. And it is the opportunity we are trying to take advantage of, because it might seem like we have a very narrow niche here, but these are millions, tens of millions of voters. They can make an enormous difference, not just in big elections, but especially in lower turnout local and state elections. All right, so let's get into how we go about doing this. It's a four-step process. We're going to go into a little bit of detail on each of these, more on the first two than the second two. But for now, for this slide, I'm just going to breeze over all four. Okay, first, we identify the voters. Now, we obviously can't individually interview every single American and ask them what their top priority is, right? No one could do that, even if they had all the time and the money in the world. So we have to find some way that's more efficient without sacrificing too much accuracy. And so what we do is we build predictive models. And I'm going to describe these in a little bit more detail over the coming slides. But for now, just know these are the same tools that presidential and Senate and gubernatorial campaigns now use to individually target voters. And I'll explain it some more in the next few slides. But for now, for this slide, just know what these tools allow us to do is individually, not by demographic group, but individually identify people on voter files who have a high likelihood of not just caring about climate and the environment, but literally listing it as their number one priority. Then, once we find these people, we can look at their public voter files. Remember, what was that one thing I told you you couldn't forget from this webinar? Whether you vote or not is public record. So when we identify these people who have a high likelihood of listing climate as their top priority, we can get rid of the good voters and just focus on the ones who we know have a history of not showing up for a particular set of elections. And they're who we target. That allows us to move to step two, mobilization. And what we've now done is isolated a population of already registered voters who no longer need their minds changed. I mean, we can now be completely agnostic with our messaging. We don't even need to talk about climate change. All we need to do is message to these voters with whatever will turn them into first-time voters and then eventually consistent voters. And I'm going to get into a little bit of our messaging later, but just know that we canvass, call, mail, and send digital ads to these voters, and we run hundreds of experiments each year isolating which messages work best to which subgroups of these voters to do one thing and just one thing only, and that is get them off their butts and out the door on election day. Step three, habit reinforcement. You don't need to live behavioral science each day like we do to understand that the way to change someone's habits is not to only talk to them once every 2 years when there are big, sexy federal elections going on. No, you need to talk to them as often as possible. That's how you build good habits. And so we at the Environmental Voter Project, we truly work year round. That is why in December of 2024, not even a month after a presidential election, we have already gotten back to work and been active in 2 different elections, and we've got more coming up. Because we truly work year round. Our approach at EVP is that no election is too small or insignificant such that we should ignore it if it's in one of the states that we work in. We use every election as an opportunity to change people's behavior, because ultimately our goal is step 4, and that is to change the electorate. We want to redress that problem that I brought up earlier, which is that there are too few climate voters, and make it so that if anybody is running for anything anywhere, they look at their voter files and they say, holy moly, where did all these environmental voters come from? Because if we can make that happen, politicians will follow. They will lead on climate, not out of the goodness of their hearts, but simply because they want to win. because nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. And so at the Environmental Voter Project, our theory of change is pretty darn simple. We believe that politicians want to win elections, and we know that the only way for politicians to win elections is to get a majority of votes. Not non-votes, but votes. And so we want to stuff that population of voters with as many climate-first voters as humanly possible. That's how we get real climate leadership. All right, I'm going to quickly go into how we go about doing this. For each of these 4 steps, I'm going to provide a different level of detail. If I breeze over any of this, such that you still have questions, please know that that's by design. I don't want to presume to know what aspect of our work you're most interested in. That's why we have a Q&A session. So please go ahead and ask questions in the Q&A if you've got them, or hold them for the Q&A session. But for now, let's jump into step 1, identification. I mentioned that we build predictive models on voter files. Very briefly, the way this process works, and again, I'm going to describe what we do at EVP, but this is the same process that very sophisticated campaigns now use to target voters, like the Trump and Harris campaigns. We start by polling huge numbers of people, tens of thousands of people. And we only ask them one question. We say, hey, what's your number 1 most important political priority? Now, let's say we poll 5,000 people in Pennsylvania, and 500 or 700 of them say climate change, clean air, clean water, some environmental issue. Well, then it's pretty easy to isolate those people on voter files and start figuring out, okay, what do we know about these people? What do we know about these 700 individuals who just self-identified as listing environmental issues as their top priority? What voter file data do we have on them? What census data? What publicly available behavioral and consumer data is there? We only use publicly available data, but there's a lot out there. And then we can start looking for certain patterns and connections. Maybe we look at those people and we realize, oh, if you're a forestry employee, you're 11 times more likely than the average Pennsylvanian to list climate as your top priority. Or maybe we see that if you have a new home but no kids, you're 6 times as likely as the average Pennsylvanian to list climate as your top priority. Maybe we even notice some weird things like, oh, basketball fans are more likely to care about the environment than baseball, hockey, or football fans. Now, none of these individual data points are predictive on their own. Even a handful of them together aren't that predictive. But when you start combining a whole bunch of them, well, then you can start having a really accurate way to find other Pennsylvanians, people who did not respond to your initial poll, who might also list climate as their top priority. And then you test the accuracy of that assumption. And then you find another group and another group and another group. And all of these hidden patterns and correlations start helping you build a model of how likely each individual Pennsylvanian is to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally list it as their number 1 priority over all other issues. Now remember, we can't interview every single Pennsylvanian, you know that. But what this is we've now found a very efficient way to predict, not know with absolute certainty, but predict with a very high degree of certainty, who are the Pennsylvanians who are really, really likely to list climate as their top priority. And what we'll do then is we will literally assign a score from 0 to 100, telling us how likely they are to fit that criteria. And what you're looking at right here is a distribution of every individual voter in the state of Pennsylvania. And as you can see, most of them have like a less than 30% likelihood of listing climate as their top priority. No surprise there, right? And then there are millions of people in the mushy middle, like maybe they care about it, maybe they don't. And then you got up here, but look at this. This is what we care about. Well over 1 million people who have a greater than 85% likelihood of listing climate as their top priority. And again, we've identified these people as individuals. And the final step is we isolate those people at the very high end of the spectrum, 85% likelihood or higher, and then we test whether they truly are people who care deeply about climate and the environment. And we test it by saying, thank you very much, data scientists. Now we're going to ask this other polling company to poll these people and ask them what their top issue is. And surprise, surprise, every time we do that, at least 85% of the respondents say, oh, climate change. Why do you ask? That's how precise these models are. And I say that not to brag. We don't build them ourselves. We have very good data scientists, but the truth is, it isn't that they're like better than everybody else. This is just where this technique has gone. It is an enormously accurate way of identifying people based on an issue that they're likely to care about. And then finally, as I said, we can just look at their public voter files, weed out the ones who are already good voters and don't need a voter turnout organization to mobilize them, and instead focus on the ones who don't vote. And just to give you a sense, these are the 42,067 individuals in Pennsylvania who are already registered to vote, have a greater than 85% likelihood of listing climate as their top priority, yet we could see in their public voter files that they had never voted in a presidential election or other election. So these were the people we were targeting this summer and fall in Philadelphia. Not to be creepy, but like we know them by name and street address. This is how we bypass the hardest, most expensive part of politics. Billions of dollars of TV ads and billboards and crap like that. We don't want to change people's minds about climate change. That is hard and expensive, and I'll leave that to other groups who like doing hard and expensive stuff. I want to do the stuff that we know we can do, and it works, and it's efficient, and we can test it, which is finding these people who don't need their minds changed and then just mobilizing them to vote. This is how we find them. Now I'm going to talk about how we mobilize them to vote. We work with thousands, literally thousands of volunteers around the country. I think latest count, we have over 7,000 volunteers to go door-to-door canvassing, make phone calls, and send postcards to these voters. Then we as a staff also run digital ad and direct mail campaigns. As I mentioned earlier, we run hundreds of randomized control trials each year, figuring out which messages work best with which subgroups of these non-voting environmentalists to get them to vote. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on messaging here. I'm happy to get into that in the Q&A if you have questions about it, but I will just tease you with a few things right now. First, I will say what we have found, and I use we very humbly and broadly. I mean, the broader field of behavioral science has found that what does not work is talking about climate change or the environment. In fact, we shouldn't even talk to people about the importance of voting at all. And I know that sounds weird. I know that sounds counterintuitive. But what does work is not trying to rationally convince people of the power of their vote. Instead, what tends to work best is to speak to people as social beings, is to figure out who do they want to be and how do they want to be seen, and how can we use that to get them to vote. Now, I realize that's very vague and academic, so let me give you some examples. We use peer pressure. We use peer pressure. We will mail people and say, oh, everybody on your street is voting this year. Just like basic juvenile peer pressure. We will also ask people if they intend to vote. Most people will be embarrassed and they'll say yes. We do this over the phone or at their door. And then we'll follow up with them right before the election and say, hey, Susie, I just want to remind you, a few months ago, you said that you were going to vote, and Tuesday's your opportunity to follow through on that promise. And we know it's important to you to keep your promises. Well, now, instead of us trying to convince Susie of the value of her one vote over a denominator of millions, we're equating the act of voting with whether she's an honest person who keeps her promises or not. And believe me, that is a hell of a lot more powerful in getting these people to vote. And remember, we already know that they list climate as their top priority. So I know that there is this urge to talk to people about this issue. But what we can see in our randomized control trials is that these are the types of messages that work best. I'm going to get into those experiments and those randomized control trials right now. But I know that you may have more questions about our messaging, and I'm happy to discuss them in the Q&A. All right. So how do we measure our impact? How do we find out which messages work best? And how do we find out if we're actually turning non-voters into voters? Well, what we do not do at the Environmental Voter Project is just assume that everybody we spoke to who ended up voting must have done it because of us. We don't like making assumptions like that. We take a very scientifically rigorous approach to everything we do. If you haven't figured this out yet, there's a reason people call us the nerds of the environmental movement, and it's stuff like I'm about to show you now. We submit all of our campaigns, all of our mobilizations to what's called randomized control trials. Very, very briefly, this is what a randomized control trial is. Let's go back to Pennsylvania as an example. So let's say we have identified 300,000 Pennsylvanians who are unlikely to vote in an upcoming election. What we do not do is immediately start calling and canvassing and mailing all 300,000 of them. Nope. Before we talk to a single one of them, we randomly separate them into two groups. One is called a treatment or intervention group. That's the one we're going to message to. And the other randomly separated group is called a control group. We will set that group aside and we will never talk to it. Now, this chart makes it look like it's an even split. Usually it's about an 80-20 or 85-15 split. The control group doesn't need to be so big as to be half of your population. It can be about 15%. But we set that control group of non-voting environmentalists aside and we don't talk to them. Then this treatment group, they're the ones who we canvass and call and mail and send digital ads to, all with this souped up behavioral science informed messaging. Then the election happens. And now for, I think, the fourth time, I will say, whether you vote or not is public record. And so a magical thing happens in the months following Election Day. And that is, depending on your state, some states are early, some states are late, voting records are updated and people's public voting histories are made available. And that way, we are able to look at all of the people in our treatment group, the people we message to, and literally see how many of them voted and how many of them stayed home. And we can compare that to the control group, the non-voting environmentalists who we randomly set aside, and see how many of them voted and how many of them stayed at home. And what this enables us to do is isolate what our sole impact was on turnout while controlling for all outside variables. If it rained in Pittsburgh and that depressed turnout, well, there are roughly the same percentage of Pittsburgh residents in our control group as in our treatment group. We controlled for that variable. Or if the Harris campaign spends $1 billion mobilizing voters in Pennsylvania, well, we've controlled for that. Unless they hacked into our system and decided to only talk to people in our treatment group and nobody in our control group, we controlled for that. This is how we are able to not only see what our impact is while controlling for what all these other groups do, but also which messages work and which messages don't work, and iterate upon those. Now, just over the last 4 years, we've probably run over 1,000 of these randomized control trials. In many small elections, we don't get what's called statistical significance, which means we can't rely on the difference between our treatment and control group as not just being due to random occurrence. But in many of the larger elections, we can achieve what's called statistical significance, which means we can say, yep, EVP was solely responsible for that increase in turnout over our control group while controlling for all outside factors, and it is not due to random occurrence. And just in 2020, 21, 22, and 23, We were able to prove that we were solely responsible for increasing turnout by as much as 1.8 percentage points in statewide general elections, 3.6 percentage points in statewide primaries, and 5.7 percentage points in local elections. And I know some of those numbers might not sound big to you, but ask Donald Trump or Kamala Harris how big 1.8 percentage points is in Pennsylvania, and they'll tell you. These numbers are the real deal. And we're extraordinarily proud of us and all of our donors and all of our volunteers for achieving them. Now, we don't have updated voter files from the most recent presidential election yet. We're going to be getting those over the coming months and reporting out to you. But I can tell you that we were mobilizing 4.8 million already registered super environmentalists across 19 states, all of whom we thought were unlikely to vote because we had looked at their public voting history and they skipped the last presidential election or the 2020 election and any election since then. And although we don't know how many of them ultimately voted or stayed at home yet, we will know that soon. We do know how many of them voted early. And of those 4.8 million super environmentalists, none of whom were supposed to show up, or else we wouldn't be talking to them, we know that over 710,000 of them not just voted, but voted early. Now, again, we're not going to just blithely take credit for getting all 710,000 of them to show up. That's why we run these randomized control trials, and we'll report back to you. But I will note, 27,000, that was the margin of victory in the Senate race in Nevada. These are really, really big numbers. Really, really big numbers. All right, so these randomized control trials are how we measure our impact on specific elections. Our second metric of how we measure our impact is over the long term. Since we launched the Environmental Voter Project at the very end of 2015 with a really small proof of concept just in Boston, which is what we did throughout 2016, we have now communicated with over 10.5 million unique voters, all of whom, by definition, were highly likely to list climate as a top priority and were really unlikely to vote, or else we wouldn't have been talking to them, right? Well, as of last February or March, which was the last time we measured this, and so we're going to measure it again in a few months, we could see in public voter files, because we've been tracking these 10.5 million people, that over 1.8 million of them had become such consistent voters that they had now voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election. They had become super voters. They had become such consistent voters that we're not talking to them anymore. They don't need a group like us. Yet, we can roll into a big election like this past fall in a swing state like Arizona and know that almost 110,000 super environmentalists are going to show up, but we don't need to talk to them anymore. This long-term growth, this is the metric of which we are most proud. Now, I do want to be clear. This is different from the previous metric, the randomized control trial. I can't claim that we are solely responsible for turning 1.8 million non-voters into super voters. In fact, we most surely are not solely responsible for that. But boy, are we pretty damn responsible. There's no other group that's now been active in almost 2,000 different local, state, and federal elections over the past 9 years. It's this year-round work that gets results like this. Okay, I'm going to speed to the finish so we've got time for a Q&A. We've been getting a lot of great recognition. And all of these outlets that you see here ran features on us for our work. And we're very proud of the recognition that we get. As I said before, we are an intensely nerdy group, an environmental group that doesn't talk to voters. We talk to non-voters, and we don't talk about the environment. So the fact that we're getting all of this coverage is a testament to some of the great results that we're getting and a lot of the great work of our volunteers and donors. I want to say we have already gotten right back to work. Already gotten right back to work. And here's how you can get involved in that work right now. Because I know we just had a huge election. Many of people aren't ready to get back in the game. But for those of you who are, we can not just put you to work right away, but we can put you to work doing something that we know yields real results. First, I want to say we are moving forward with these three promises in mind. First, we will continue with a brutal, honest analysis. We care about being effective rather than just seeming effective. We are running brand new predictive models so that we can accurately identify these non-voting environmentalists. We're looking at these randomized control trials to see which messages worked and which messages didn't work. We're not like a political campaign who really worries about looking good even when they lose. No, we've even posted videos of our failures. When we have a message that doesn't work, we not only want to own up to it and admit it, we want to warn everybody else, hey, don't do this. We're really smart people and we messed this up, so we don't want you to as well. So we're going to continue with that brutal, honest analysis. Two, we are always building political power. We have already run, I believe, 3 phone banks since the presidential election. And as I'll show you soon, there are upcoming elections in places like Texas and Virginia and Louisiana, and then tons of elections in January and February and March that aren't just important in their own right, but they offer great opportunities to build up this block of consistent climate voters. And the third promise we always make is to respect our volunteers and donors. We know that your time is valuable. You don't want to volunteer just to feel good, although that's probably some of it. You want to volunteer because you know you're making a difference. And so we don't just post this stuff on our website. We report back to you after each phone bank, after each canvas, after each postcarding campaign. After all of our mobilizations, we report back and let people know our results. Because we know you're not just doing this because you're bored. You're doing this often because you're scared, you're worried, you want to make a difference. Just in the upcoming month, we are going to be working on the statewide Louisiana election that's happening on Saturday, December 7th, the El Paso, Texas mayoral runoff, and the Virginia State Senate District 32 special election. Believe me, there are going to be a lot more of these coming up. There's probably going to be a link in the chat where you can sign up for phone banks to mobilize our voters for these elections. But I want you to know we are back to work. Hell, maybe right now, as we are on this webinar, we have volunteers making calls because we work all the time building up the political power of the climate movement. What's next for us? As I mentioned, we will be doing phone banking and digital ad campaigns. We've already started that. We started in mid-November to mobilize voters. We are also researching expansion states. I showed you that map of 19 states where we worked in this past year. We are doing a 50-state research project right now to figure out, if we should expand into additional states, and we'll be announcing that in the new year. We are building and validating new voter identification models. We will always want to be as accurate as possible in finding these non-voting environmentalists. And then in January, in January and probably February for postcarding, we will start up canvassing and postcarding again. Finally, it takes some states a long time and some states a short time to release updated voter data from 2024. When we have enough of that data that it makes sense to start reporting out those results, we will really, really look forward to doing that. And so if you are interested in getting back in the game, boy, do we have proven ways for you to make a difference. First, we would welcome you becoming a monthly donor. In order to get these results, you need to work year-round. And in order to work year-round, you need consistent year-round funding. And so even if it's $5 a month, even if it's $10 a month, we ask you, if you believe in this work and want to make a difference, to click on that link that's been shared and become a monthly donor. Simple truth is, most people aren't thinking about politics December, January, February, March of each year. Shocking, I know. And most of our work is funded by these monthly donations during those months. Second, sign up for a phone bank. Every phone bank begins with a training. You are then given a proven script. One of the benefits of running all these randomized control trials is that we are able to never ask a volunteer to do anything unless it has been proven to work. Whenever you're on the phone or on the door or writing a postcard for the Environmental Voter Project, you are using messaging that has been proven to work in randomized control trials. So sign up for a phone bank. You'll use a proven script. You'll get trained. You won't have to start until you're ready. Your phone number won't show up on the call. It'll be ours, and you can start making a difference right away. And then finally, stay tuned for canvassing operations to start up again in January and postcarding opportunities again in February. All right. Thank you so much for your patience. Thank you so much for this great crowd. I'm really excited to get to your questions. So Ren, what do we got?
Before we get started, I just want to echo Nathaniel had mentioned. Thank you very much, everyone, for sharing your questions and for placing your questions in the Q&A section. So with that, we're going to get started by Harvey's question, Harvey S. Harvey wrote, it would be much appreciated if EVP would be able to talk about the ideas and examples that are most effective in getting people who are concerned about the environment to vote. And he asked, please be as specific as you can.
All right, Harvey, thank you for your question. I will be specific, but first, let me start at sort of a broader academic level, because I think that will be helpful. And then I promise I will get into specific examples. Okay, so first let me start at this broader academic level. As I mentioned before, behavioral scientists have found that when you're trying to change someone's behavior, it's usually better to treat them as a social being rather than a rational being. And let me give you an example of this. Let's take my state. I live in Massachusetts. Let's take Massachusetts as an example. Deep blue liberal Massachusetts, right? Well, in the presidential election that just happened, there was no possible way that any Massachusetts resident voted because they thought their vote would make a difference. No way in hell. Everybody knew that Kamala Harris was going to win Massachusetts. Most congressional incumbents ran unopposed, and the closest race that was opposed was decided by like 13 or more points. We have 200 state reps and senators, and almost none of those elections were close. So in short, like nobody in their right mind in Massachusetts could have thought that their vote in 2024 would have had an actual impact on anything. Yet, over 3.5 million people cast ballots in Massachusetts this fall. Now, why in God's name did they bother voting? Well, most likely, it had less to do with the perceived value of their vote or some rational cost-benefit analysis that they were making than it did with how these millions of Massachusetts residents wanted to feel about themselves or how they wanted to be viewed by others. Maybe they wanted to be part of history, or maybe they wanted to seem like responsible, good citizens, or set a good example for their kids. Or maybe they talk about politics all the time and didn't want to be embarrassed by not voting. But whatever it was, our decision to vote almost always has more to do with who we are as social beings rather than us being rationally convinced of the importance of voting. All right. I promised I'd get to specific examples that prove this out, or some examples that we have done. So what are some things that get environmentalists to vote that are not based on trying to rationally convince them of the importance of voting, but instead view them as social animals? One thing is loss aversion. We have some experiments, and Ren, perhaps you can share them in the chat. I think we have a report just on our loss aversion mail. This increased turnout, I believe, 5 percentage points in a Savannah mayoral election, just sending one mailing with this messaging. What loss aversion is Human beings hate losing things. We hate losing things so much that we are more upset at losing a dollar than we are at finding a dollar. And you can apply this behavioral psychology concept to voter turnout in the following ways. There are a whole bunch of people who vote in presidential elections, but no other elections. And we wanted to get these people, these drop-off voters, to vote in these lower turnout elections. And so instead of treating this act of voting in a local election as something new that they had to do for the first time, we wanted to make it seem like the fact that they had voted in a presidential election had given them something of value. And they would lose that thing of value if they skipped this local election. And so what we did, it was a very simple mail piece, is we said, thank you for voting in the blah 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 election. Now don't ruin your new good voting history by skipping this upcoming election. We wanted to make it seem like they were going to lose something if they did not vote. It's a very simple thing, has nothing to do with climate and the environment. Boosted turnout a shocking 5 percentage points over our control group. All right, that's one example. Another example, we use the behavioral science concept of trending norms. It is also very closely related to FOMO, fear of missing out. So many of you are probably familiar with the concept of social norms. So if society says you should do X, but you're not doing X, maybe you feel pressure to fit into that social norm. Well, trending norms are related to that. What we do is we let people know, not only is everybody in your state voting, not only is this norm established where everybody or a lot of people are doing something, but you're not, but it's actually trending away from you. And so what we'll do is we'll send people mail, simple postcards showing in 2016, this many Texans voted. In 2020, this many Texans voted. In 2024, this many Texans voted. And the bars just keep getting bigger and bigger. And holy moly, like if you don't hurry up and get to the polling place, you're going to be like the last Texan left who's not voting. We want to make it seem like there is this enormous trend where everybody is doing the thing that you're not doing, and don't be left behind. It's very simple FOMO, but it works. There are countless other examples like this, and I really, really appreciate the question. Ren, please put in the link, a link to our reports and studies, and you'll be able to see lots more examples like this of successful experiments where we have gotten people to vote. And you can see the literal language we used and the design of our digital ads or our direct mail or our scripts. But thank you. Thank you for that question.
Great, thanks, Nathaniel. Sorry, I was typing at the same time trying to get the questions. I am not Shannon, I'm not a fast typer, but but the second question is from Susan and also Harvey. It's the same question. They ask, why aren't maybe you get this often, but why aren't specific reasons that tens of millions of voters are not voting? So essentially, they're asking why they aren't voting.
Yeah, why aren't environmentalists voting? Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Harvey. I know. uh, okay, so similar to the last question, I'm going to start with sort of a caveat and then get to answering your question because we do like to be precise and nuanced here. Social scientists are really good at figuring out how to get people to do things by like running randomized control trials. What they're not very good at is figuring out why people don't do things. If you're trying to figure out why someone, say, doesn't vote, really the only tool you have is a poll. Is to poll them and ask them, hey, why aren't you voting? And when you poll people and ask them why they're not doing this thing that society views as being important, guess what happens? They lie their pants off. Something called social desirability bias. It's been proven over and over and over again that when you ask people why they're not doing something, especially something that they know they ought to be doing, they tend to give you reasons that they think are the most like socially acceptable excuses for not doing that. So this is a long way of me sort of issuing a caveat, Susan and Harvey, to say It's really hard to answer that question with the type of precision that we would like. So we don't know. And anybody who tells you they know why someone isn't voting is probably lying themselves or just doesn't know enough to realize that it's a pretty imprecise answer. However, I can tell you two things. First, one of the things that's going on here is when you look at people who are the most likely to list climate and the environment as their top priority, they are disproportionately young, disproportionately people of color, and disproportionately lower income. What do those three groups have in common? People of color, young people, and lower income people. Not only do they all vote less often, but they're all the object of voter suppression efforts. Now, I'm not going to claim that this is solely due to voter suppression, but that's part of what's going on there. When your movement is made up disproportionately of people of color, young people, and lower income people, they are just going to vote less often. And some of that is due to the fact that people just make it harder for those folks to vote. But the second thing that's going on here, and we've got a fair amount of evidence on this, is that the environmental movement for decades has been strangely apolitical. And here's what I mean by that. When you ask people how to make an impact on climate change or clean air or clean water, they will almost always respond by talking about purely personal individual actions they can take. Like, oh, I'm changing how I get to work, or I change the food that I eat, or I've changed the electricity that I consume, all of which are important, don't get me wrong. But they're weirdly apolitical, right? Like you would never hear someone who's concerned about gun violence talk that way. No, they understand that gun violence is a systemic political problem that requires a systemic political solution. But we in the climate movement haven't internalized that. We often view ourselves as the villains. And then when we start searching for solutions, we don't think about politics. We think about how to change our personal behavior. And that's a big problem. And that's a lot of what is going on here with lower voter turnout in the climate movement, because we don't see that as an obvious solution to what is clearly a set of systemic political problems. You can't change your personal behavior to shut down a coal-fired power plant. You just can't. And so we need to reinvigorate the climate and environmental movement in a political way and get them to start understanding that political avenues are how we solve these problems. All right, I think we've got time for one more question.
Great. I'm so glad you said that because we're nearing time. I'll combine these questions together since they're related. These are from Patrick and Cheryl. They wrote, it seems that many voters are uninformed. Is it risky to encourage people to vote when they may be uninformed about candidates who care about climate change? Second, how the voter deal with candidate, how does the voter deal with a candidate and candidate selection? And lastly, if the candidates have no environmental positions or ambiguous campaign position, then how do they select? How do the voters select?
These are really, really great questions, Patrick and Cheryl. Uh, First thing that I will say is just because people don't vote doesn't mean that they are uninformed. And I'm not just saying that to be cute. There's actually a decent amount of research showing that actually it's very easy for people to for most elections. I won't claim this is the case for, school committee races and library trustee races and things like that. But for most elections, it's pretty easy for people to figure out who is the best candidate on climate, environmental issues, things like that. Second, I will say there are lots of groups that focus on that. Now, for legal reasons, we can't both mobilize these voters and tell them, oh, this candidate is best and this candidate isn't. But I will say, one, there are lots of great groups that focus on that second part. And two, there's a lot of evidence showing that in many ways, non-voters are oddly just as informed and able to make informed choices as consistent voters are. The final thing that I will just say on this point is, we are a nonpartisan organization. And I want to be very, very clear about that. But if you look at public polling data, uh, you know, there was no issue constituency group that broke harder for, say, Kamala Harris over Donald Trump than people who listed climate change as their #1 priority. No issue constituency group that broke harder than climate voters did. Now, maybe you think they were wrong. Maybe you think they should have voted for someone else. Maybe you think they're right. But what I will say is, one, we're not going to tell people who to vote for. But what we do know is that we're not mobilizing people who just kind of sort of vaguely feel good about climate. We are mobilizing people who, like, you shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate change. It is literally their #1 priority over all other issues. And second, all the evidence out there shows that these people, although often apolitical, are not uninformed or unable to find out information. Now, again, I want to be clear. We don't only focus on Democrats or independents or Republicans. We are nonpartisan. Someone lists climate as their #1 priority and they ain't voting. We want to get them to the polls. We want to get them to the polls, whether it's a primary or a general or a special. But yes, we do feel very confident that they are making the right decisions when they get there. And finally, I will just say, remember, it isn't just about electing the right people. It's also about getting the right people to show up. We're so used to viewing politics from, like, the supply side of the marketplace. Like, hey, if we just elect the right people, everything will be fine. Well, yeah, selecting the right people is important, but it's nowhere close to being sufficient. Because even when we elect the so-called right people, as I said before, it isn't like they can just snap their fingers and get everything they want done. No, they still need to look at the people who actually voted, figure out what their priorities are, and then pick and choose what to spend their political capital on. And right now, even when we elect the right people, boy, is it hard for them to justify spending that political capital on climate and the environment. And I use the most recent presidential election as an example of that. Not only did we end up electing someone who calls climate change a hoax, but let's be honest, the Democratic nominee looked at all the available data and decided that the best way to win the most important swing state in the nation was to brag about oil production and defend fracking. And I'm not casting judgment on anybody here. I'm just saying we've got a problem. We've got a problem in the climate movement. And that is, when politicians run for office, they ain't scared of us. They don't look at the electorate and say, oof, I need to worry about what climate voters are doing. And we're going to try to change that. All right. Thank you so, so much for attending this webinar. We are enormously grateful to everybody who is interested in our work, but particularly folks who just a few weeks after a presidential election are interested in getting back in the game. Thank you so, so much. I hope you'll go to environmentalvoter.org, sign up for some phone banks, make a monthly donation, or just sign up for our email list, because whenever you're ready to get back in the game, we are ready to have you and ready to help you make a difference. Thanks, everybody.